Romans 13, 1 and 2. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists that God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment.
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, church. I doubt if you've heard a sermon on this topic before, but it's one that presents to us as we go through the book of Romans, trying to see how we can be like Jesus. A few years ago, we were worshiping, minding our own business, enjoying the fellowship we have with God, and all of a sudden, the government said we can no longer come together to worship. Now, the government's role is to keep us safe. And it's a gift from God. If you look at Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, that's where government started. When Noah was told if somebody would take the life of another man, because man is created in the image of God, his life would be taken by man. And so we have laws from that point on trying to be established to keep us safe. Now, we as Christians, our role is to save souls. And so we tried the best we could to keep worshiping in the way we could until we got to this day, Chris, and we can go back to the way it used to be. And yes, there are so many benefits. I had so many memories come back as I was taking the Lord's Supper. I felt so much better. But I thought back of a night, July the 18th, or maybe it was the 19th, 1864. Just before that, Christians were behaving themselves, carrying on. They were really getting a bad reputation as those Christians because they were part of what we learn today to be the upside-down kingdom from Josiah. We just didn't do things the way everybody else does. And so Christians became notable in a notorious way, and maybe the world looked at Christianity and felt a bit guilty, but for whatever reason, they weren't happy. And then that night, Rome was set on fire. And a rumor was started that the Caesar of the day, who was Nero, had started it. And as much as what Nero tried to get rid of that rumor, he couldn't. And so in the Annals, Annals 15, book 15, chapters 38 and chapters 44, you see how this blame was shifted from Nero to Christians. And so what it says here in Annals 15, book 15, chapter 44, it says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. So why would Nero do that? I want you to imagine that America has a very popular vacation place, Hawaii. And let's say Hawaii has a lot of places where the native Hawaiians live, and they take up some of the best real estate. And somebody has this crazy idea of let's burn them out and have a lot of them killed by fire and destruction, and then I can come in as a hero and I can rebuild this and get in more tourist dollars and things. That would be an awful thing, wouldn't it? And that's kind of what was in Nero's head when he thought about this. And so a lot of beautiful things of Rome was destroyed, but Christianity was not disrupted, was not destroyed. Yes, Christianity came under fire like you won't believe. And this is going to happen from time to time. And if Christians would do what Christians did then, the church will continue to always grow. So we ended chapter 12 last week with love. And we heard that, we mustn't let evil overcome love, Don't let an evil overcome love. And we saw how those were the bookends of Romans chapter 12, verse 9 and verse 21. And now seated between this great idea of love and this incredible love that's going to continue after this, comes this idea of we have to, and how we have to deal with society. And so you have, first of all, faithful submission. If you look at the F, you'll look at the institution, the acronym for FIRE. You'll look at how we are responsible to live as responsible citizens. And finally, I want to also have a look at the eternal consequences of the way we live our lives. So if you have your Bibles, open to Romans chapter 13. We have about 18 minutes to get through this lesson. So we're going to look at this from three different aspects. We're going to look at this from what does the Bible say about it? In Romans chapter 30, verses 1 through 7. I also want to very quickly, becoming like Christ, I want to look at what Christ will say about each one of these topics when it comes to the government. I want us to look at Daniel. Daniel was the guy that was so involved in civil society, yet he made such wise choices. And not just Daniel, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also made good choices. And then we're going to also have an application by one of the other characters of the Bible. Esther will be one of the applications we'll have. So let's begin by going forward here and looking at the faithful submission, which is verses 1 and 2, which was read to us by Josiah. Let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So that is the premise. Everything else that's going to be said is going to be based on that. There is a lot of leeway over here. There's a lot of misinterpretation, a lot of different ways we can look at it. So be very careful of listening to what I say about it. Look, it's very black and white, isn't it? And that's why I'm giving you so many illustrations, because one of the greatest atrocities done in our lifetime is abortion. And the government's role is to what? Christians' role is to keep us, to save souls. What is the government's role? To keep us safe. Well, these babies aren't being kept safe. And so yes, we can speak out against it, but how do we do that? When we're told we cannot worship, like they were told in Rome, where those Christians were fleeing for their lives, where they were worshiping in the catacombs underground in the Roman underground system, they still worshiped. There's a right and a wrong way for us to go about doing this. And so I've just read to you. You can translate it as you want, but the closer you stick to those words, the better. Verse 2, therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So I can stand back here, and I can let a few of you take over and tell me who are these governing authorities. What we might come up with is, where I come from, if the police start taking bribes, your country is in a lot of trouble. When the politicians take bribes, your country is in a lot of trouble. So this world, basically, because of that, is in a lot of trouble. You can look at places, and maybe we shouldn't do this too much, but you can look at California and you can say, I wonder how they're doing with law and order. And what's going to happen if it keeps going that way? If you can keep robbing a store of $950 worth of merchandise, and the police keep getting less and less money, what's eventually going to happen? Well, there'll be anarchy, because the government will not be able to keep the citizens safe anymore, and obviously shopkeepers will move out, and so this whole thing will turn over. And I've seen it. I've seen it firsthand and with my own eyes in living in a country where there was anarchy and how mob justice took over. And you don't want to see that. You don't want to live in a world like that. So the government has to keep us safe. So I can say the police, I can say the mayors of the cities, I can say, what about the firemen? They have a badge. Can somebody like Adam carrying a badge say to me at an accident scene, Neville, you need to sit there and be still? Well, I can say, I know better. And Adam knows I might walk for about a minute and a half and I might fall over dead if I don't listen to him. So we've got to listen to whoever is placed over us in positions of authority. Because of verse 2, therefore whoever resists authorities resists what God has appointed. So there is no authority that exists that God has not put in. So Pilate is busy talking to Jesus one day, and he asks Jesus a question about whether he's a king. And Jesus answers him and says, listen, I'm not a threat to you. Yes, I'm a king, because he says, my kingdom is not of this world. So in other words, we today have dual citizenship. We might be Americans, but we're definitely kingdoms of heaven. We might say we're in this world, but we're not of this world. So we have responsibilities to both. And so that's what Jesus is saying. He's basically saying, if I wanted to, if my kingdom is of this world, the people, my servants would fight. Now, who are Christ's servants? How many soldiers, or how many angels could he have called? Right? So this is when it comes to faithful submission. He's basically telling Pilate, whatever you decide, I'm going to submit to your authority. And we'll see in the second point why. Going on to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you look at Daniel chapter 3, verse 5, they are asked to worship a golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had established. So let's see why this happened. Because you might read this and come up with your own set of ideas as to why. Whenever government crosses the line into worship, that's where Christians say we are going to obey God rather than men. Whenever the government of the day says to Peter and John, stop preaching in the name of this Jesus, or we're going to beat you. What do they say? Can we listen to you or man? But it's only when they are told to not worship, or when they're told to bow down in a form of worship, because government's role is to keep us safe, not to cross the line. But God's kingdom is to ask us to keep worshiping Him. And that's why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning, fiery furnace. And He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods. See there? It's about worshiping and serving. Will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. All right, and then by way of application, we can have a look at Daniel praying 3 times. And Daniel in chapter 6 has been given, and we'll go back to this point, he's been given this, because he's such a good citizen, he's been given this elevated, he has such an excellent spirit, he's been given this elevated position, and the people around him don't like it. So they want to get rid of Daniel. So we can only get rid of Daniel in the way he worships his God. We know that he worships his God 3 times a day, so we're going to have 30 days, no worship, no praying, no serving any God or man except you, O Darius. And so the idea is, okay, worship the king. And that's where it's not going to happen. That's where we, as God's people, in a very dignant way, very respectful way, we're going to do those do's and don'ts. Do trust in God's sovereignty. Do pray continually as Daniel did. Do exhibit respect. Do not compromise your faith. Do not rebel or resist. Do not disrespect. And he prays 3 times, and we see that things happen. He's thrown into a lion's den, and God closes the lions' mouths. Daniel and Darius is praying and fasting for Daniel all night. He's really perturbed by this. Next day, Daniel is released from the lions because they can't do anything. And the perpetrators who set up against God's kingdom are put in place. And so an incredible story as we come to the conclusion of that first point. Always have faithful submission. And I tried my best not to give my opinion on it because there's so many opinions on this thing. But I ask you, implore you, go back to God's Word. Do not read your case into it and try to understand it. Rather, read the text and let it apply to you. Exegesis instead of eisegesis. And then God's institution. Every institution, and this is the eye of fire institution, every institution on the face of this earth is there because God has put it there. And so there is no such thing as a secular government. You might think you're a secular government, but you can't be. Because the authority that you have, it can be no authority unless it comes from God. We know Jesus said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. So whatever authority he is given is in that case. So here we go for verse 3. It says, For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. That's capital punishment. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Very briefly, there's two types of grace. There's the grace that God gives Christians, but then there's the common grace which God gives every man so that we can live in society and we can live with law and order. And so this is what he's talking about here. And when Jesus is asked by Pilate to explain this, Jesus says this. So Pilate said to him, Will you not speak to me? Do you not realize that I have authority to release you, authority to crucify you? Jesus answered him, Listen, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greatest sin. And I believe he's talking to the high priest here, because the high priest did two things wrong. The high priest did a civil wrong. If you had a good lawyer, you could have taken that high priest to court. He was wrong. He broke civil law. Pilate said repeatedly, I find no sin in this guy. Do you want Barabbas? You know, they're accusing Jesus of insurrection, not paying taxes and getting people. And what was Barabbas really in for? Insurrection. So you can see the civil problem over there with the civil law. But then there's also the religious law. They weren't faithful to God's law of looking for the Messiah, so there they broke righteousness. They were unrighteous. And so they're doubly at fault over there. Going on then with our example from Daniel chapter 2, all the dreamers, the wise men are going to be put to death. And Daniel says, wait a minute. He implores to God. God at night reveals his dream to him. And then he comes up with these words. He changes the times, the seasons. This is Daniel praising God. He removes the kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. And so this shows again that God is in charge of the institutions of this world. And do's and don'ts, you can look at an excellent spirit also that was in Joseph, how he is even given the signet ring from Pharaoh. And in fact, by doing that, he rides in the second chariot. Pharaoh will be in the front, but he is almost like a father to Pharaoh. And that's what he ultimately would say there. And so the do's and don'ts: do serve with integrity, do uphold justice, do acknowledge God's role, do not compromise morality, do not abuse authority, and do not neglect justice. And so then we come to the R of the word fire. We are to live as responsible citizens. In fact, Christians should be model citizens in every time. We should be the best. You want to know what a good citizen is like? Look at a Christian. We're not going to be the insurrectionists. We're not going to be the people marching and causing trouble, unless you can find a scripture in the Bible where Jesus did that. And you won't find it. He didn't. And so we've got to do that. And so we come to this idea of responsibilities as citizens, and we look at verses 5 and 6 for that. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Two reasons why you're going to be good. Conscience, if I'm going over the speed limit, my conscience should start getting me, and also I don't want to entail God's wrath. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. And we'll carry on with verse 7 just now as to what all you have to do as good citizens in the last point, which will be the eternal point. But look at Jesus being caught over here, and they're trying to trap him. And so they say to him, what about taxes? And he says, give me one of those coins. And they bring a coin. He says, whose image is on this? And they say, Caesar's. And he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and the things to God that belong to God. And so we'll look at that and say, that's pretty much how we have to interact with being good citizens. And you can see Daniel, as I said, would come back to this one. He is such a good citizen that he gets elevated to this point where they would be jealous of him. Then Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because of an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So as a citizen, do you have an excellent spirit in you? Do you have one that is praiseworthy, one that people can say, wow, that guy, he is with complete integrity. That's the type of person I want to have. And then we go to the example, which is Esther. Remember, Esther was caught in a very bad situation where her people were going to be murdered off. Now, Uncle Mordecai said, listen, Esther, you're the only person who can take care of this. And he knew Esther's life would be in danger. Esther did it so gently. So if you're going to go against government, look at Esther. Look at her spirit. Look at how with fear and trepidation she came to her husband with this request. And how it turned, because she did it correctly, how it turned out against the people who were plotting. Unfortunately, there are going to be bad people in government. At every level, there are going to be bad people. We should say, you know what? We're going to fall on this side of it, not on the other side of it. I want you to understand, when Paul wrote these words, 6 years later, after he said submitting to governmental authorities, 6 years later, in that riot probably, he was murdered. He was murdered. Jesus, while he's telling Pilate, I'm going to obey governmental authorities, just moments later, he's murdered. You understand? This is the example of how we should, even if we don't worry about anything when it comes to government keeping us safe, even if they're misguided. We worry about saving souls, and that's ultimately where we're going to go. So do's and don'ts, do advocate for justice, but caveat, keep reading. I've put these little words there, but do it like Esther interceded for her people. Read that example. Then do participate in civic duties. Do live with integrity. And when I come against do participate in civic duties, I could talk about the Jehovah's Witnesses who won't go to military, they won't they won't serve, and so on. And I think we shouldn't do that. I think we should participate in civic duties, do live with integrity, and then do not remain silent, do not neglect civic involvement, and do not compromise ethics. And finally, we come to the eternal perspective, and we've just run out of time, so bear with me. We'll sing a few less songs next time, right? We're getting used to this new way of doing it, the old way of doing it. Romans chapter 13, verse 7 says this, pay to all what is owed to them, taxes, revenue, respect, and honor to those that it is owed. And then we can look at Christ saying, do not lay up for yourself treasures where moth and rust can destroy and thieves can break in and steal, but rather lay up for yourself treasures where neither moths can destroy or rust can destroy, and so on. And then he says these final words, verse 21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will always be. And so it has to do with an eternal perspective. And you can see this in Daniel's life where he says these words, and to him, this is talking about Christ, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, one that shall not be destroyed. And so we have some do's and don'ts here. Do trust God's timing. Do prioritize heavenly treasures. Do live with contentment. Do not forsake the trust that you have in God. Do not chase earthly wealth, and do not covet or complain. And the example we have is is of Abraham. God asked Abraham, he said, Abraham, I need you to go from the Ur of the Chaldeans to a place that you do not know. You could read about this in Hebrews chapter 11 from verse 6, 7, and 8. Keep reading about Sarah and so on. And he did, even though he did not know what God wanted of him. We can keep reading. We can see that he was asked even to sacrifice his son, and he said, I'm going to do that. So trust God, and everything's going to be okay. But there's an eternal perspective to this thing. We need to fear God. And so when it comes to this, we need to understand that to become a child of the King, we need to be born again. We need to be baptized with Jesus in his death. We need to be baptized with Jesus in his burial, and we need to raise to walk a new life. If you've not done that, that's where the ultimate authority comes from. And so the question I have is, how big, as we conclude, how big is the Summit Church of Christ? We don't measure it by the amount of people in the seats. We measure it by the amount of people we send out to talk about Jesus to the world. Our role is to save souls, and let's not get detracted from this. If you are a subject of the gospel invitation today, please consider coming forward, either for the prayers of this church or to be baptized. Whatever you need is come forward right now as together we stand and sing.